you, Becky. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me here. I'm coming at you from lovely, and it is lovely today, Buffalo, New York. So inside my office, you can see this is a mural that some of my clients created for me. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I'll just very briefly just mention my creds, my chops here. I have the privilege of providing the Ask the Lawyer service for some of the regional library councils, and because of that, I get questions from many of you out there that give me the opportunity to research some really interesting and oftentimes very serious situations. It's been a great privilege this year to work with you as we've gotten through just a few crises together, and that was partly what inspired this, the lemonade of crisis response. I want to encourage, as I am saying things and you have questions, please pop them into the chat, into the feed loop, and Becky's going to wait for a little interval and then jump on in with them, because to the extent that we can make this interactive and simulate what would have been our in-person experience, I'd like to do that, especially since you've had a very packed day. So with that, what I want to talk about is I want to share with you, and the heart of this presentation is the form that is available. We're going to be looking at it in the slides today, so you don't need to pull it up, but if you want to, go right ahead and pull it on up. Is this response form that I've created. But the goal of this session is to acquaint you with some of the concepts of the federal and the nationwide incident management response system, the National Incident Management System, NIMS. And NIMS is a crisis response system that came out of the response to 9/11. If you recall, in 9/11, of course, things were happening at the towers, and immediately numerous response agencies showed up on scene: federal, state, city, county, et cetera, et cetera. And not so shockingly, when you get a bunch of type A, highly trained responders in one place, there were potentially some territorial battles that resulted. And that prompted the federal government to work hard to create this national incident management system, which is really designed to give people a way to fall in quickly and collaborate, rather than have territory battles or just lack of clarity when it comes to how we organize an incident response. Now, hopefully, although maybe it felt like this to you this year a little bit, none of you will have to organize a response that involves multiple fatalities, massive property destruction, all of that kind of thing. But for those of you who don't know me, I'll just mention briefly, aside from doing Ask the Lawyer, before I was doing that and working at my law office here in Buffalo, I was in-house counsel at Niagara University in Niagara Falls, New York. And when I was there, I had the privilege of being trained in the National Incident Management System. The university I have a library. I got into this because of partly because of Dave Shane at the Niagara University Library, and I loved working with him. But while I was there, the power of the library is situated right near Niagara Falls and right near a New York Power Authority hydroelectric station. And so after 9/11, that area, and it's also right on the border of Canada. For a lot of reasons, the university was identified as an area where we wanted to make sure that there were people highly trained in the National Incident Management System. So as the in-house attorney at the university, I got to be on the response team, which fortunately, I didn't have to deal with a major large-scale incident, so knock on wood for that. But what I found in working with this system, and I'm going to show you, for those of you who are so intrigued by the National Incident Management System, you want to do a little Googling on your own while I'm talking, there's a wonderful series of guides that come off of this link that talk about how this system works. And this is what I got trained in. And as I said, we drilled on it, we developed policy around it. We never really used it for a major incident, thank goodness. But I found, as I was doing smaller, right, the kind of crises that a lot of you might, if you get home at the end of the day and, someone says, well, how was your day? And you say, oh, I was putting out fires, right? I was dealing with situations. As I got to know this system, I found that the same tools were useful for handling the types of fires we put out on a more regular basis. Crises that, could impact our institutions, your libraries, or a learning institution. And it translated really well, because in our day-to-day, even if we're not handling a major catastrophe, we're still having to coordinate with state and local government, right? A lot of you this year, as you're thinking about your budgets and you're thinking about the overall response of your communities to the pandemic, you're probably working with a lot of your county and your municipal authorities, a little bit more than you perhaps normally do. The system gives a framework for all of that to put together. Now, the incident command system training I'm talking about that is linked on this is multiple days with multiple hours of training. I'm not going to run you through that. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about that, and then take a deep look at this form and talk about how to pull together a crisis response, right? So first, take a look at the form. I want to talk about the importance of naming things. Now, I probably don't need to sell this as much for people who are information management professionals as I do to other crowds, but I'll just mention, you'll see in the middle of the form. So let's say your library has an incident. Perhaps there's a serious safety concern involving an old wing of the library, or perhaps there was a safety incident involving a particular individual and the situation is ongoing, right? Whenever you are dealing with a crisis, or some of you may have been dealing with this crisis called pandemic, and you had to develop a safety plan, all of that, right? Giving an incident a name so that people can have a frame of reference to talk about it is critical. And how you name that incident is critical as well. I imagine that as you deal with things, much like me, you probably come up with entertaining nicknames for the situations that you're managing. I can't think of anything at this point in the day that's not offensive, so I will not say some of the nicknames that in my head I give to certain crises, right? But when I give an incident name in the professional sense, it's always if it's involving the building, the building floor situation, the ceiling situation, the lack of qualified personnel situation, whatever it might be, right? You're going to give it a name, and that is going to give you a handy way to coordinate your response to the situation with others in your organization. All right, so if your response is part of a larger village-wide, town-wide, county-wide, statewide incident, it's also going to be helpful for you to have a way of thinking about the impact of the incident on the library with its own name versus the larger situation. So if you have a situation, one of the things I've been trained for is active shooter. And for some of your libraries maybe have done some training in active shooter, or if you're at an institution that has that type of response plan, you know that not only is local law enforcement, right, but the county and sometimes state and sometimes other responding authorities are going to arrive on scene. So one of the important pieces of vocabulary to keep in mind is incident command, right? It's the incident command system. And think about incident command. And whenever you find, if your library is in the midst of a situation that's part of a larger crisis, you have to find out who is in charge of the incident command. I'm just going to skip ahead to show you a little bit on that, right? So you're going to see there's a space on this form to think about that. And that's because I want you to be thinking about your crisis response in the context of if this is something that is going beyond your library in any way, even if it's just affecting a couple blocks around your library, if there's a chemical spill, something like that. So, and this is a multi-purpose form. It's really meant to just help you go ahead and start filling things out and thinking about things that in the moment you might not otherwise think about, right? So first of all, within any institution, you should make sure you've designated who's going to keep the records, who's going to fill out this form. Most likely it's probably the library director, unless you have a larger framework where maybe there's an assistant director or a manager who would be delegated with this task, right? To maintain this form. Who names the incident? Let's say there is a chemical spill in front of your library, right? Chemical spill incident of November 6, 2020, right? And you've got on the form, and this is a writable form that we've created for you to use. Joanna in my office set this up after I haphazardly dictated it. So shout out to Joanna. Thank you very much. People who put up with lawyer dictation deserve a special award. So we've got this. You can enter the date and time and a brief description, right? A truck overturned in front of the library, chemicals were spilled, causing environmental hazards and the need to evacuate the library and potential cleanup obligations and property concerns. Boom, done. Yeah, you write that up. The next section of the form you'll see is what is the library response goal? So many times when a library is in the moment, and this is, I get called in from time to time to help libraries with, something bad has happened, right? There's been an accident on site, there's been property damage, there's maybe a threat to human life, while we're dealing with the immediate or qualified people, maybe even police, et cetera, are dealing with the incident, you should be thinking about what is the response goal of the library, right? And when in doubt, always coming back to the library's mission, right? So something like, to continue the library's mission, we will make sure that we work with the appropriate authorities to verify that the spill is cleaned up so it is safe for the employees and the public to use library services as soon as possible, right? That would be a good goal in the chemical spill scenario that I talked about. So in that kind of situation, you're going to be thinking about what is it, when did it happen, what is the brief description, and what is our goal in handling this? The reason it's important to think about your goal and to think about it in the context of putting your mission first is because you never know where one of these incidents is eventually going to lead. And in my world, sometimes these things lead to court. And I'll just share a brief experience. I did use this in managing a particularly large situation that ended up being worth several millions of dollars in property, no life loss, thank goodness. And I found myself in the unusual position that no lawyer really likes to be in, of being a witness, right? I was a witness in a case, and having to talk about how a response to something was organized. And having my thoughts formulated this way and saying, well, in this situation, the goal was always the safety and continued operations with things restored to normal, right? Gave me language to always talk about what informed decision making. So when I got challenged about it, and many of you probably experience challenges to actions that have been taken, whether maybe you're a director and your board might have questions about, well, why was something done a certain way? Members of the public at a board meeting might have questions. You often deal with regulatory authorities, you're performing your reports. When you have a focal point for handling an unusual situation that's a mission-informed goal, it really helps just to say, well, here's why we did this. Here's why we did this, right? And you always bring it back to the response goal. So, and before the end of this, we're going to practice because I'm going to ask you to start thinking because I'm going to ask you to throw out some scenarios and we are going to practice together composing response goals. So then you can come up, exercise your creativity and start coming up with some scenarios. And we will talk about how maybe we would compose a response goal to go along with that. And people can chime in. Because again, interactivity is good. So now there's some more important information when you're gathering and you're composing your response plan that you want to gather, right? So number one, what is the potential impact on your mission or your plan of service? So if you're cataloging, okay, the library is here to perform certain critical functions within our community that we know are important. That's our mission. And we've outlined the really important concrete ways through which we fulfill that, right? And that's the plan of service. And you might have extra things you do, but you know that if it's critical, it's going in that plan of service. So you sit back and you think, okay, this chemical spill has happened, or the library has had a fire and there's serious property damage, or you name it. You think about what is the potential impact on the mission and plan of service. And you're listing that so that as you formulate your response, and partly, as you formulate your response goal, you're thinking, what can we do to make sure that the impact on mission and the impact on the plan of service are minimized? This is also the kind of thing, again, if you get challenged on an action, how many times have you been at a meeting and maybe someone in the public says, well, why did you do this? Why did you spend this thing? Why did you do this emergency procurement? All these things. If you can say, well, here's our mission, here's our plan of service, these are our fundamental things that we have to achieve, and the potential impact of the situation was X, Y, Z, and we mitigated it by doing this, right? You have that in your head, you've written it down, you've composed it. It'll just rattle out of you at those critical moments of stress. And that way you can save all of your energy for actually dealing with the crisis instead of dealing with people's perceptions about how you deal with the crisis, if that makes sense. So I spent a lot of time before I opened my law firm, having to make sure that my actions were well rationalized. So the next thing that's important to start gathering, and Becky, anytime if someone has any questions or anything like that, just pop right on in.
Okay, none. Oh, and wow, that your psychic powers must be on, because one just popped in as you were asking. Julia Scholl in Baldwinsville, what constitutes an incident? Patrons fighting without weapons, or with weapons versus without weapons versus with weapons?
That is a really, really great question. Thank you. So the incident response, the ICS model that I'm talking about, that link has actually ranks different crises on a scale of 1 to 4, right? And 4, I can never remember, is 1 the worst or 4 the worst, but basically, it ranks it on, is the incident handled same day, right, with one responding agency, and maybe that's it. And that would be your classic, maybe someone has a medical event in the library and there's going to be an ambulance coming in, right? That can be a 1. A 2 is, minor disruptions to partial, to part of operations. Maybe you have to shut down half the library while you're cleaning something up, dealing with it, and it's going to last a day or 2 longer. The next more serious level would be, serious impact requiring major modification of operations. And I would say actually the pandemic qualifies as a 3, right? Because the worst one is complete existential threat, which, as I run across different situations, as I read newspaper articles about what libraries are facing, these days in particular, sometimes a fiscal crisis can actually manifest at the highest level of incident, right? Because if it ends up being a threat to the very existence of the institution, that actually qualifies as an incident. A lot of people think of incidents really just in terms of, wow, something crazy really happened today. But it's really any occurrence, the cumulative risk of which is going to, again, on that sliding scale, impact things minorly in the moment, maybe for the same day, maybe have a slightly more disruption, and then serious disruption, serious modification of operations, and then at the point where, right, it's really shut down, everything is not operating at all, right? And that's the reason I say, for libraries that so impressively made that jump to, wow, how can we still serve our community when our facilities are closed, right? How can we pump up our online programming? How can we do all those things? To me, that was like a level 3 crisis response, right? Pandemic is certainly a crisis. So that's where I would say an incident is. It doesn't necessarily have to be, for me, I've dealt with this in situations of, even just dangerous conditions that haven't manifested yet. But when you have to recognize the condition, it requires that you take action, even though the bad thing that you're fearful of has not occurred. It's still a situation that's going to cause that disruption. I can't even see any thumbs up, so hopefully it'll work. Becky will let me know if there's still some questions on that.
We had a couple more. How to deal with or observing domestic violence incident within the public library?
Oh. few things on that. So any incident of violence, just because of where I sit and the way I have to see the world as an attorney who's always thinking about liability and compliance, and also thinking about it from the perspective of domestic violence in the library could quickly also become workplace violence that the library employees, as well as the patrons, are exposed to. So I would call that at the very least a level 1, right? Sort of on that level of a medical event, maybe a level 2, depending on what has to happen, right? Depending on how serious the response has to be. Does the incident happen and the perpetrator leaves and then you're left with aftermath, right? That's a 1. Or are they staying and they're yelling and they're causing a disruption and posing an active threat? So, obviously, in that moment of initial response or occurrence, the people who are handling things, calling 911, for instance, they're not pulling out this form at the exact same moment. But honestly, if you have a team that, if you have the capacity, pulling out the form the moment that everybody involved in the situation is in a safe space and doesn't require you to be just acting, again, making that phone call to 911, trying to get people to say, having people exit sections, et cetera, et cetera. That's when I'd say, yeah, using a form like this actually can prompt a lot of assistance, because depending on your locality, if you take a look here, I've got this section for the incident response team. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm actually going to go ahead. So you'll see here is a section where you would fill out the agencies who responded to the incident. So depending on your locality and the resources for domestic violence in your area, there may be someone from DV court or the domestic violence victims advocacy group in your area who ends up needing to work with the library. If someone gets a protective order so that they can still come to the library knowing that their abuser is barred from the library, you may be working with the people that you would list on this section of the form in order to make sure that you're following that protective order. If the person is an employee, that employee may need modifications for their day-to-day work. Maybe they no longer can work in front of the big plate glass window at the library because they're fearful and they have a protective order. That means that the library has to work with them on that, because in the state of New York, domestic violence victim is a protected status, right? Just like religion, age, disability, race, ethnicity, et cetera. So in the employment context, particularly, right? So that's why, I've got this on the form like that. But yes, that would be, again, once you're out of the immediate moment, having someone who is thinking about the things on this form in response to that would definitely be appropriate.
And we just have a couple more, if you don't mind.
Sure, no, this is good. This is better.
So I think you just touched on this as you were saying, but maybe just a little more clarity. Should library staff contact law enforcement and not intervene in violent incidents?
This grows more critical every day in our country, right? I think a lot of us, if we weren't aware of some of the hesitations that people might have about calling law enforcement in particular instances, we're now aware of that. Libraries and library boards particularly need to think about having a violence in the workplace policy. And that policy needs to contemplate that question. There's no blanket answer I can give. Some places have personnel or have a security structure who have enough training to, with confidence and with assurance that they know what they're doing, move in and execute de-escalation techniques, right? This really depends on, again, it's a level of training that I can't simply say, oh, sure, anybody should feel like they can go ahead and de-escalate. It pains me to say that, because the best de-escalation I ever saw was a young man. He looked very strong. He was probably in his 20s, and he was clearly having a mental health, and I suspected it was impacted by some substance issues as well. Just a complete breakdown on a street corner, and people were coming out and watching, but he was thrashing, and he was angry, he was raging, and he was just violent. And my neighbor, bless her heart, I think she was maybe 75 at the time, You know, and I'm going to say it, you know, I always thought of her as the church lady because I knew she was very devoted to her church and all this. And she just came out and she just gave him a hug and it worked, right? And I would love to say that I had the confidence that we all had that level of de-escalation within us, but that's not the case. And so what's important, what the big takeaway from my answer to that question should be, every library should know the answer to that question, right? There should be some type of policy. Depending on the type and size of institution, the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, OSHA, has an entire program that it likes to see places have. Look at that. Look at me talking about compliance. It's the law. OSHA has workplace violence policy expectations, right, and requirements for certain environments. It's a huge issue, and so the answer is going to be different depending on the size of the institution, the capacity of the institution, and the resources. And there are some instances where, you know, calling 911 is going to be the only option. That nobody should be doing guesswork on that, right? So if there isn't a workplace violence prevention policy in place already at a library, that's a good one to put on the board's to-do list. And again, it can't be something you just go look at and grab from another institution. It needs to be the product of some thinking about the specific capability, you know, and layout of the library itself, and the personnel it employs and the structure it uses as well. So sorry, I wish I could give a better answer on that one.
Do you mind taking one more and then I'll let you get back to your, okay, great. So Peter at New York Public Library, what is an organization's role or responsibility in the safety of staff off of library property, but just after they've left work or just before they're arriving during the commute?
Well, I'm going to give my lawyer answer first because I have to. So, and you know what the lawyer answer is, it depends. So there's actually a line of workers' comp cases, Peter, about this type of thing, because it depends on, and I think in your question, I got the sense that you know, you're not talking about people who are traveling to different places for work, right? So it's not someone who went to, you know, is exiting the mobile library van and is now walking into the library, right? And isn't that sort of professional transit time, but this is really getting to work. So the legal responsibility, once someone is off of the premises and not performing work functions, right? And trust me, we could have an entire day's seminar on when do work functions stop and start, right? So I'm gonna own that uncertainty right there. But legal wise, that would be difficult. Thinking about how, and let's get back to workplace violence prevention, wellness for employees, right? How can we configure so that people have the safest circumstances possible, so that we have a healthy, you know, confident workforce, right? That's a matter of policy and retention, and sometimes also a question for unions, right? It can become a contract question as well. So yeah, there's no bright line rule of like when and where it stops and starts, but that's another one I would say, if you raise it proactively as aside from the legal liability part, as any institution should be seeking to attract, develop, and retain the best workforce they can. And to me, that's partly how, that's one of the ways you do that, is making sure that people are feeling safe in the workplace and in the general context of their work. So it is somewhat of a punt on, except for the hardcore legal part of it, but there's a lot of play in there to work, especially in a thoughtful, like, planning kind of way, right? And in a risk management way. Anything else out there, Becky, right now, or?
There's one question about what about a library staff's ability to protect themselves? For example, self-defense if someone were to attempt to assault them?
Yes. So I am a big fan of training whenever possible, because being trained and practicing to handle certain things, make sure that rather than improvising what you're doing in the moment, you're instead basing what you're doing on at least some kind of like muscle and obviously, you know, cognitive memory, right? And so, so for instance, I think I mentioned I've done active shooter training, and what was surprising to me, I read up on this, it was so surprising to me, I actually tried to call on it and did some more research and was like, okay, they're right, is in the active shooter training, they don't tell you to do one thing over another. They say, if you can, run to safety. If you are not capable of that, shelter in place, right? If you can, try and overpower the active shooter, right? Have a plan, right? Work with people. It changes. And so my answer to that would be, again, while there's no blanket answer, like, yes, everyone should know Krav Maga. Okay, I actually think everyone should know Krav Maga, although I don't. I sword fight, but I don't bring well, I do bring my sword to work, but I can't advise that you do that because I'm self-employed here in my law office. So anyway, my employees who are listening and are probably laughing at me right now. But some kind of training that is appropriate to the environment that you're in and the resources that your library has. That's what's really important, right? So some places address this by, having the panic button and making sure that the design of the library lends itself to being able to shelter in place and be isolated, and restrict access to someone who would be an assailant. Definitely, I keep coming back to it because it really is critical, because it forces thinking on all of these contingencies that people are raising, right? Having that workplace violence prevention. I know I've spoken about this at some library events before. I'll just briefly say, when I was a teenager, I worked at the New Hartford Public Library. That's where I got my start, my love of libraries. Although the Utica Public Library is also beautiful, and that's where I got my first card. But anyway, I worked at the New Hartford Public Library, and I actually, I was the page and someone was stalking me, right? And one of the staff members there intervened and just dealt with that very decisively. So decisiveness and having policies that address these types of hypotheticals, so that they're not so much hypothetical as knowing, well, yes, we have a policy that addresses some of these things that we've identified are concerns that could be specific to our environment or could be general or endemic to just libraries in general. It's important, absolutely. So, how's it going, Becky?
It's going.
It's going.
Lots of thank yous. Peter said thank you for your thoughtful answer and insights. And let's see. Someone's wondering, do some libraries have assigned panicked or designated rooms for such situations?
So I don't know of any specifically. Probably if I did, I couldn't mention it anyway, maybe, confidentiality and all that. But I do know that many institutions, so I've worked with institutions that have gone so far as to even have published floor plans with directions to resources like that. That very much could be part of, if you're at an institution that's large enough that it has developed an active shooter or incident response plan, right? Sometimes having those posted and making sure they're posted in multiple languages, and having, even getting them, obviously we have to be thinking about accessibility, and disability awareness and these kinds of things as well, right? It can't just be a sign on the door. It has to be a holistic approach. The holistic approach takes planning and money, right? But any approach on this takes planning and money. So there's no right answer. What I would say is, for libraries that are thinking about these things, this is where partnering and having the great relationship. I'm just going to go back with the forms. So, these relationships I mentioned here, wow, that made my hand really big. I'm sorry. The relationships I mentioned on the form, using the agencies, in my experience, many times local law enforcement, county law enforcement, different types of first responding agencies will come in and do some type of safety assessment work. Because what you don't want to have is a bunch of well-intentioned but not uninformed, people without the right qualifications to be developing that safety plan and that safety approach. And I'm not even saying I'm that person, right? You want people who can say, well, here's what you want to do and here's why, right? And so people who have the appropriate training to help a library develop that plan. That's really the way to go. And like I said, I've seen advice from the appropriate authorities that really takes it just about anywhere. Shelter in place, evacuate, have other plans, right? I worked with an institution that, they decided that the most important thing they needed was a institution-wide public address system so that they could tell people to evacuate as effectively as possible. And that was where that they looked at the overall scenario, that the most likely scenarios they would face, and they decided that based on the design and the situations that might be the most likely, the most important thing was being able to tell people to get the heck out of here, right? Proceed to the exits. That was critical. And in making that decision, the decision was that they were going to emphasize and do an analysis of, if people are using mobility devices, right? Can we actually affect that plan? Can we affect that evacuation, right? That they did testing and found that they needed to improve several areas of egress in order to actually find that, make that be the best plan for everybody. So once you make the decision, then saying, okay, then practicing a few times and saying, okay, are we going to do this? So if identifying that shelter in place is the way to do it, drilling until people get the muscle memory so that in the moment their body takes over, their instincts take over, and they do what they practice to do, right? That's really important. And there are different grants out there for this type of training. It's if your institution has a grant writer, or someone, right? If everybody's always asking grant writers to try and find this stuff, but it's out there, right? And a lot of if there's higher education institutions near you, sometimes they get those grants. There's a program called the Border Protection. So if you happen to be a border community, there's extra there's extra funding out there for this kind of thing, and there has been since 9/11. So it's out there, and it's another thing to throw in a long range plan. This isn't the kind of thing that you say, well, we're going to do something and it's done by the next week. Maybe you come up with an ad hoc plan, right? A placeholder plan until the next week, but really, doing it in a very methodical way with people who have the credentials to do it is important. And they are in your communities, hiding out. They're not hiding. They're in plain sight. At law enforcement agencies, in universities, colleges, community colleges, etc. They're there, right?
That's it at the moment. Just a lot of thank yous, and it's very informative.
Oh, good. All right. So I'm going to go back to this spot here. So let's see. So if we look on, so as I said, you're thinking, okay, someone's going to be filling out the form. It might not be the person who's in charge of the overall response, right? This might be you might designate someone as the scribe who is filling out this form, right? So you're naming the situation, you're taking note of the date and time, you've got your brief description, you're thinking about the goal in the context of the mission and the plan of service of your library. Now, and the next thing is, who is the response team who's handling this? Now, for level 1, for a minor incident, it might just be 1 or 2 people, right? I do say whenever you have an incident, there should be at least 2 people. You should use the buddy system, right? There should be at least 2 people, because you don't want people to have to go through handling any kind of crisis alone. It's lonely, it's stressful, and we always, even if you pick the most challenging and cantankerous coworker you have, that might actually be the best, because when you're in crisis response mode, you're going to be adrenalized, you're going to make quick decisions, right? I'm the kind of person, if something happens, and my mother trained me to do this, right? I instantly go to, we will do this, we will solve this, we will do this, make it happen, boom, right? I make sure I have someone on my team who's saying, okay, Cole, just hold on, did you think about X, Y, Z, right? So incident response team. The reason I like and advise clients to think about, and this doesn't have to be a formal thing, although certainly boards can vote to appoint or designate an incident response team, or it's certainly something a a director should feel that, it's within their authority to delegate, right? Is who's doing what, right? So if you have a situation where safety is implicated in any way, appointing someone whose only job is to think about the safety of the response, right? You're thinking about safety. That's their only job. That can be really, really helpful. In some of the scenarios I've talked about, so, in the accessibility scenario, the evacuation scenario I talked about, the person who was in charge of safety was the one saying, well, hold on, if the fire alarm is going off, then the fire doors are closed, and can someone who's using a mobility device get out as effectively, or do we have to upgrade the technology, right? So having someone whose only job is to think about safety can be helpful. Of course, you got to listen to the person, right? But that's their job. Who's in charge? Sometimes, again, depending on the size of the institution, when I think about the different hats that a library director has to wear, and all the things that they have to do, if there's someone that they can designate who is the team leader for the crisis response, maybe because it's a smaller incident, while they're handling the overall operations of the library, that's definitely a possibility. And frankly, being the team leader on a small, discrete crisis response initiative is really good development training for future leaders, right? So if your library is thinking about succession planning, this is the kind of thing where, and we're going to talk about why a little bit more in the time we have left. I'm going to get through everything, trust me, but please keep the questions coming, because
we do have one call.
Oh,
sorry
sure.
to interrupt.
Sure. No.
I work in a large library system. After many people being away from their regular locations for months, how do you recommend approaching managers about getting retrained in active shooter training and other emergency response?
I think so. I always put this in the context, and you're going to hear this from me, right? You always bring it back to mission and plan of service, and when people are coming back, actually, so number one, you bring it back to mission and plan of service, and you say, we want to make sure everybody's ready to serve the library. But I would also say, actually, when you think about it, even just the fact that here we are, we're at NYLA, right? This is NYLA 2020, and I'm here in Buffalo, New York, and you're where you are, and we're coming up with new habits. I've decided that I wear headphones when I present because I want a physical signifier that things are different, right? And it looks cool. I think it looks cool. So I would approach it if you're in a place where this would be a sympathetic point of view, is to say, well, we're all coming back. This is a great time. If we had habits that we wanted to change, as we come back, let's deliberately not continue those old habits, right? And we simultaneously need to emphasize our strong habits, right? And good habits and good practices. And we've all had a heightened awareness about safety, and we want to continue that. And we'd like to have an active shooter training. We'd like to have crisis response training. And I would also say that raising that in the context of, is there an emergency response plan or an active shooter plan or a crisis, any kind of policy, a workplace violence policy, that's a good way to raise it as well, is to say this is just a piece of how we're going to attract, retain, and develop the best workforce. And also, be ready to serve our community in times of stress, right? So I'd lead at it, depending. There's not much when it comes to, there's one other technique, could work. Insurance carriers, if anyone was at my morning one, I love talking about insurance, but it's important, right? So insurance carriers love it when their insureds, the institutions that they insure for things like, general premises liability, and worksite injury, all that kind of thing. They really like it when their insureds train the workforce and are taking steps to lessen the likelihood that there would be some need to pay out an insurance claim. And so sometimes carriers have some resources to tap into, or there could be a discount to the insurance premium that could be used to offset the cost of bringing in a qualified trainer, right? So those are all approaches to trying to integrate policy development and training about safety and incident response into the workplace as we're all coming back. It's also depending on your relationship with some of your municipalities or other community members, taking a look and seeing, well, is our town being trained? Is our county being trained? Is the college down the road being trained? Can we get in on that training? Looking for places where you might be able to collaborate is another one. And that can really, that can really add something. Librarians being present at another institution's training can actually, can be additive as well. So there's some other options, exploring the efficiencies, looking for the grant money, but tap those insurance carriers because sometimes they have some good input. So as you put together, your team, let's see, we talked about, having someone who, again, they're not going to be thinking about this 24/7. They're going to be doing their normal job, but as part of, whenever the crisis response is being considered, they're going to be the ones who are tasked with thinking about safety, and they don't have to mellow or complicate their thinkings about safety with all the other things, right? If it's a crisis that is going to invite media attention, having someone who is the communications lead and maybe who's also monitoring social media is a really good idea. Again, this having these things designated, the leadership designated and confirmed, and the roles of people, I have found it really helps because, when you're in crisis response mode, almost everybody is stressed. And a lot of people are going to say, well, I think you should be doing this. I think you should be doing this. I think you should be doing this, right? By being able to say, you're going to take that concern to our safety lead. Oh, you see somebody, saying something nasty about the library on Facebook and how we aren't responding right. You're going to have our communications lead deal with that, right? It gives you a nice structure to root everything into. And on that note, designating someone as the record keeper can be critical. And that's if the incident, if it looks like it could be leading you into court, and if it looks like it's going to be costly, if there's a cost to the response, that maybe you would want to pursue those costs, maybe in your library's own legal action, right? Having a record keeper who's responsible for all the records that are being generated about this. They're making sure they get the screenshots of the abusive Facebook poster. They're getting the receipts from everything. They're collecting the newspaper articles, right? And they're all of those things. They're taking pictures. If the safety person is saying, wow, we need to put a big sign up here, right? This area restricted, don't come in. Taking a picture to show that was done. All those things, right? Documenting the response, that can come in handy. We'll talk about lawyers in a minute. So another important thing is, the whole concept of the need to know and establishing, well, who needs to know, who's actually responsible, right? This kind of approach helps you have clarity about those things. So you see in this form, I have put, well, there's a space to say, when was the board leadership informed? Now for those level 3s and 4s, right, you might be waking up your board member at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? If the library is on fire, that might be appropriate. So you're informing them at 2 a.m., right? Other things, they might not need to know as quickly. That's going to depend on management style and a slew of things. But it also sets up the stage of board leadership is supposed to be informed. They may end up, especially if we're talking about a very small library with a very small staff capacity, they may end up being on the response team. That doesn't necessarily mean they are leading up the response team. The response team should be led by the most qualified person who has the time, and the resources to do so, right? So this is a good way to confirm roles. If a board president or vice president is saying, well, obviously I'm going to be the one who's going to lead through this crisis, even if it's something that really falls into the usual span of control of the director, then this form is a good way to prompt the conversation and document the clarity, right? And hopefully that conversation goes well, because I know that it can always be a little bit delicate. You'll notice I also have another section. When did you inform your insurance carrier? Right, that's in the event that there's property damage, you know, a physical injury, anything like that, right? You want to, this is to remind you to notify the insurance carrier that there was property damage and to record when that happened. And your record, it's one of the things that the record keeper should be keeping, right? If an email went out to your insurance carrier that said, oh geez, you know, we had a fire, you know, in one room, we've lost, you know, 1/10 of the collection, you know, seeing, okay, well, when did we let them know, and then making sure the record of correspondence with the carrier is being kept. So obviously we have the spaces here for, you know, who are the responding agencies, and getting that contact information. Sometimes you might be talking to the responding, you know, police chief, fire chief, etc., and just forget to get their name, right? So having this on hand, fill this out. What is their role? You know, what is their contact info? I didn't put a spot for phone number, but, you know, hopefully you get their business card as well. And then I have this section of just the action and communications log. Now, depending on the size of your incident, this form is going to be really inadequate. You know, I've only got a few slots on here, but you see the point of this, right? Is you're going to start recording, well, what is the action? Who's the person responsible? And what is the result, right? So an action might be, well, the board decided we have to close the library, right? Who did that? The board. Result, library is closed until, you know, whatever, January 1st, 2021, right? Next action, the board is hiring a contractor to board up the burned out windows, you know, whatever it's going to be, right? Just so that you have a systematic record of the response. And this is just a sheet for tracking the expenses. It's another one where, you know, obviously the sheet, you know, if you have a serious incident, this sheet is not going to be big enough, right? But you get it going, and then you can start keeping the record. And I trust that many of you know how to crack into my fillable form and, you know, generate one of your own. So, and it is licensed to you for you to use and do that. So, a really, really important part of this, and I want to make sure we just spend a few minutes on it, and we will have some time for some more questions, or I can keep talking too, so don't worry. After action assessment, that's a big part of the incident command system. And you might even, if depending on the agencies that respond to the incident, you might even be able to do some after action assessment with them. It basically is after the dust is settled, after everyone is safe, the situation is managed as best it can be, you're getting back on track to normal, and you're able to take a look at the record that's been generated, taking a look and seeing, okay, how did we do? What could we have done better? This is actually, and we are going to talk about being careful to put certain conclusions in writing in certain ways, so I am going to get to that, but this is where, by keeping these kinds of records, if you have, and again, even for minor instances, right? If you have this kind of record organized at the end of the year, and maybe you've used this kind of form 3 times for 3 different things, you can look at that information and you have already assembled something to show to the board, strategic planning committee, you know, during budget discussions. You have that proof to say, look, you know, we had a violent incident in the library. We handled it pretty well, but people were scared. What could we do better? We want some training, right? So over time, not in the moment, but over time, this also becomes a useful aggregate of the information of things that are, you know, crises, that are incidents that are implicated, that have implications for your operations. I do want to say that in the after action assessment, you want to be very careful to not say things like, wow, we really screwed this up and we think we're going to get sued, right? Because a document like this can be subject to FOIL. You'll see I have a section here for when was the library's attorney informed? Now you don't need to call your attorney for every possible thing, right? I can't believe I just said that, but you know, budgets being what they are, you're just not going to. But you know, anytime there's a suspicion of liability, if you have an employee who has been made the victim of violence, you know, those are things to check in with the lawyer on. And many times a lawyer might actually become part of your response team. And what the lawyer is going to do is come in and set up so that certain parts of the response when you need legal advice, when they're going to be informed by legal advice, that the back and forth on that is going to be kept in such a way that it's subject to attorney-client privilege. And it's really not a magical formula. It's really, you write to the lawyer, you say attorney-client privilege communication, right? And things go back and forth in that way. It shouldn't be every, if you're just inviting your lawyer to come over for coffee, that's not attorney-client privilege necessarily. But the minute you're actually seeking the legal advice, you're getting the legal advice. This is important for any institution that is subject to FOIL, because attorney-client privilege communications can be withheld from things that are otherwise FOILable. And also, if there's a lawsuit, some of this information could be subject to discovery, meaning it could be subpoenaed, it could come out in depositions, right? And so again, if you're at the point where you're thinking about liability, or you're thinking about bringing a lawsuit of your own, you're bringing the attorney on, or the insurance carrier has designated an attorney, that attorney is going to come up with a plan for, okay, how much of this do we want to keep offline in a different confidential manner? So, Becky, do we have any questions? I think we have a couple minutes.
Oh yes, we do have questions.
All right.
Julia Scholl, interesting question. Onondaga County had a major hacking incident last year. Would a local library do an incident report? Not part of the county library, but a member of the county library. We left the incident report to them. Should we have done one ourselves?
So, sorry. So yeah, as I was mentioning, sometimes your incident is going to be part of a larger incident, right? And yes, I would think anytime there's a larger situation, but it has its own unique and special impact on your library, there's no harm in doing a form like this, right? Even if it's really used. So if you go to the team part, team leader, okay, so team leader is going to be, person ABC. And it turns out that as team leader, person ABC, their only job is to interface with the larger responding agency, right? So you've got your other responding agencies in here. And if that's the only thing that the team leader has to do, and maybe, in a hacking incident, I don't know if you necessarily designate someone responsible for safety per se, but maybe you'd say to someone, you know what, we just want you thinking about the privacy implications for this. Just bring up your concerns, and and maybe it won't come of anything, but we just want you on the team thinking about that, right? Or your own IT person in that kind of incident, something like that. There's no harm in doing your own, because again, at the end, right, it gives you a really good record of the things that have impacted the library, which comes in handy again for strategic planning, for budgeting, for your own policy development, for risk management, right? Having this kind of information all gathered together, even if it's really just, the reason I loved using this approach is because when a board member, because I had to serve the board of the institution I worked at when I got this kind of training, right? When a board member asked me a question, or I was dealing with somebody, having it gathered this way meant I had the information much more accessible to me. So if the information wasn't right top of mind, I could look it up for them very, very quickly. And so it helps with your professionalism in handling these things, right? And again, sometimes an incident can go dormant for like a year, and then all of a sudden the violent person returns, or right, the thing that you thought got fixed starts to, the structure you thought was fixed starts to fail again. You pull out the file and you say, okay, here was the incident from the last time. We're going to open a new incident file, but we've got all the information from the old incident as well.
And when you were talking about just on the teams, there was a question earlier. If you're in a smaller library and you have a small staff, is it okay to have people have multiple roles, or at that point should you pull in board members to fill roles? That's
a great question. I think either answer is, either one is right. So you can do either, and should. And sometimes you might even pull in a volunteer who agrees to help out, right? Who's not a board member. If you do that, I do recommend there be some kind of letter in place, and obviously the board is there can be some complications with that, but it might be necessary. It's just their role should be formalized, especially if they're performing professional services, right? Like if you bring in a forensic accountant or something somebody who's volunteering. So I think what's really important is that the team leader is the team leader, right? And the safety person is doing safety. And communications, you know, sometimes you can double up on the communications, right? The leader can also be the head communicator. But one of the most valuable pieces of training I got, so my trainer was a gentleman named Bill Coria, who had actually was semi-famous out here in Western New York because he had led a team that rescued someone who was clinging to a boulder on the brink of Niagara Falls, and led a very daring helicopter rescue with a team. And so Bill was great, and he was battle tested. And when I talk about the kind of people who know how to assess a safety situation, he was one of these people, right? And Bill was very careful to emphasize this: in any crisis, you have to be very aware of the span of control. ICS talks about this incident command system training, right? The span of control is how much is any one person in charge of. And the scientific research that he relied on in presenting this to me was that any one person should have 7 things that they are in charge of at any given time. And then after that, efficiency plummets. So in a crisis, you have to be very aware of the span of control. Am I putting too much on this person, right? This person has a very clearly outlined area of responsibility in the crisis. They're also handling, you know, our usual ongoing operations. I'm not giving them any more. The team leader needs to be aware of that too. If the team leader has too much coming in and then has too big a span of control, it's going to fall apart. So that's the more important thing, is making sure that you're not exceeding, you know, a realistic span of control.
And I know we're at time, but we have one more pretty timely question concerning COVID, if you don't mind. With COVID-19 contact tracking and quarantine of employees becoming more normal, would you use a similar process to document steps taken?
Oh, you know, I just actually put an Ask the Lawyer up about this because of the privacy implications of collecting the medical, right, the medical information. So very briefly, I would say the overall response to the pandemic might be something you would approach to this, but the key to that should be in your safety plan, right? And the safety plans should continue to evolve. Whenever possible, the board doesn't need to be drafting the safety plan, but the board should be the one that's at every meeting, they're taking a look and seeing, has the safety plan had to evolve? Have we made changes? You know, do our employees have the right resources and the capacity to live up to the safety plan? Have the needs of the community changed, and thus, or have the legal requirements changed, and thus we're changing the safety plan? So that's definitely something to think about and make sure is documented, and if necessary, is evolving in the safety plan. Great question, thank you.
Okay, again, I feel like this is another one of those sessions that could go on for forever, but we are at time. Congratulations, everyone. You made it through your first virtual conference ever. And thank you, Cole, for all of the information. Again, this PDF is shared at the session files of this program, and you will continue to have access to the Feedloop platform through the end of the year, through December 31st. So again, thank you so much, Cole, and thank you, everyone, NYLA members. You've made what was a terrifying endeavor very fun, I'll say. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, thank you, Cole, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. All right, take care.
Bye.